According to the 2018 member survey released by the US-China Business Council in September this year, 3/4 of American companies report that their business has been affected by current bilateral trade tensions, but the Chinese market remains one of the most important to their bottom lines. What are American companies' most pressing concerns about doing business in China, and what would rekindle their optimism? Welcome to this special edition of The Point with me, Lu Xin, coming to you from Shanghai. My first guest today is Greg Allen, President of the US-China Business Council. Ambassador Allen, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
I understand that the U.S. business delegation is the third largest delegation taking part in the first China International Import Expo. Could you explain to us the kind of enthusiasm that's been demonstrated by U.S. businesses in China amid the background of trade tensions?
Well, thank you very much for having me on. I'm very grateful to you. This is an important time between the United States and China. We have a high level of tension created by imbalances, structural imbalances within the relationship. And we are very pleased that President Xi and President Trump will be meeting in the beginning of December in Buenos Aires to address those tensions. American businesses in China are very happy with a rapidly growing market, with a middle-class consumer base that is expanding very rapidly, and with increasing opportunities throughout the country. This is the time. 2018 is the year in which domestic demand will lead economic growth in China. I believe that approximately 80% of the economic growth in China, estimated at about 6.5%, will be due to domestic demand. And American companies are very excited to participate in that process.
At the opening of the CIIE, President Xi gave a keynote speech in which he emphasized that the doors of China's opening up will not close. China will open ever wider. And he has made this point on several occasions over the past year. How do you look at the kind of achievements China has made, the concrete actions China has taken over the past years?
We appreciated President Xi's speech very much, and he articulated a range of policy measures that China would be taking in the near future. And I have to say that it is quite impressive. He promised a liberalization of telecommunications and e-commerce. He promised that foreign companies would be treated equally as Chinese companies. He promised greater protections for intellectual property rights. And those are excellent goals. However, the devil is in the details. And American companies and the American government are anxious to see if the details implementing those regulations will actually happen. Let me give you an example. Recently, it was announced that there would be restrictions lifted on equity capitalization. And that was a wonderful announcement. However, 0 companies have been permitted to take control of the joint venture. So an announcement is an announcement. We definitely need to see the details, and we would like to see the details as quickly as possible before the Trump-Xi meeting. And so I urge our Chinese government colleagues to, as quickly as possible, release the details of President Xi's vision. The sooner the better.
Message, I think, is picked up, and I think the fact that we are having this import expo is a welcome sign, I believe. However, at the moment, the frictions between the two countries are causing a little bit, to say the least, anxiety, if not actual losses. You have released a 2018 member survey in September this year, and the key findings include that American companies face significant challenges in their business operations with China due to trade frictions, but the market remains one of the most important to their bottom lines. Negative impact of tariffs is clear and far-reaching, and rising costs a top concern, and supply chains are significantly impacted, with some companies reassessing their investment plans. So many companies, I understand, are considering if they want to close their factories in China, they want to relocate maybe to Southeast Asia, but not back to the United States. So have these tariffs achieved the kind of goal that President Trump intended to revive the U.S. manufacturing?
Well, it's an interesting question. So global supply chains are always in motion. Even preceding the Trump administration, many textile, apparel, toy, furniture companies were moving out of China because China is no longer a low labor cost market. And so supply chains are always in motion. Now, and that is a natural phenomenon. We have had no evidence that companies are leaving China yet for other markets outside of the normal flow of trade and sourcing. However, I think the longer the tariffs are in place and the higher the tariffs are, the greater the pressure will be to adjust supply chains. And adjusting supply chains is a very expensive proposition. And what that will mean for customers, either Chinese customers or American customers, is higher prices. And I don't think many American customers or Chinese customers will welcome higher prices.
What kind of a blow will it be, however, if indeed nothing gets resolved in the near term and that additional tariffs will come into effect at the beginning of next year? What kind of a blow would that be?
Well, my concerns are several-fold. Firstly, tariffs affect the poorest people the most, and that would be true in China as well as in the United States. So low-income people spend a higher percentage of their income on food and consumption of products as opposed to services. So it will affect low-income people the most. I am also concerned about the inflationary effects of additional tariffs. Interest rates in the United States are probably going up no matter what. And tariffs will have accelerate that dynamic more than anybody would like. And I think that that is a very important thing to keep in mind, and a reason to go very carefully and cautiously in erecting new trade barriers. Interest rates will have an effect on exchange rates, and that could have unintended global consequences if we are not careful. If we look at South Africa, if we look at Argentina, if we look at Turkey, clearly emerging markets have been affected by exchange rate volatility. More exchange rate volatility in the global markets will not have a positive effect for some very important countries.
So are you saying the exchange rate volatility or fluctuation is the biggest concern for U.S. businesses in China?
No, no.
What would be?
The biggest concern for American businesses in China is a level playing field. We would like to be able to compete directly with...
But at this moment there's a stalemate, yeah, between the two sides yet. I mean, until we see something moving ahead. So what are you looking out for during this meeting between the two presidents?
Excellent. Thank you very much. So President Xi at CIIE articulated a reform program that is bold and comprehensive. I believe that if Chinese bureaucrats are able to put meat on the bones, to articulate exactly what he means in terms of regulatory practice, that will create a very positive environment for President Xi and President Trump to have their meeting.
Well, I understand you are not going to criticize the U.S. president, but on the other hand, a negotiation is never a one-way street. What would have to come from the U.S. side for this negotiation to really produce an obtainable result?
Well,
or to have any result at all? I mean, if just one side caving in, it's not going to work.
No, I think that we recognize very clearly that China is a great country and it's in nobody's interest for there to be a one-sided negotiation. China has had a very large trade surplus with the United States for decades and decades. The economic relationship between the two countries has created great prosperity in both countries, and we wish for that to continue. We wish to deepen the relationship, to work with China to engage on global issues. We would like to engage with China on reform of the WTO, of updating of the WTO. So the opportunity is there for to expand the economic relationship, expand investment going both ways, if we are able to deal with some of the structural problems within the bilateral relationship. And those problems are symbolized, not created by, but symbolized by the trade deficit. So we do need to address that through competition enhancing, market access opening and reform, as President Xi indicated at CIIE. And then we need a longer-term negotiation and diplomatic engagement to address the other issues. And I think that is attainable within the next month. When our two leaders meet, it is in both countries' interests, and indeed, I will argue it is in Asia's interest and global interest for there to be a mutually supportive trade and investment enhancing agreement between our two leaders, and I do believe that is possible in the near term.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Allen, for accepting our interview.
What a wonderful privilege. Thank you very much.
And you have been watching The Point with me, Li Xin. We're going to take a very short break, and when I come back, I'll be talking to a business community leader from Canada. Stay with me. My guest today is Sarah Kutulakos, the Executive Director of the Canada-China Business Council, or CCBC. Ms. Kutulakos, thank you very much for accepting our interview.
Thank you for having me.
So I'm going to refer to the keynote speech that President Xi gave during the opening ceremony. He talked a lot about openness, the steps China wants to take along that direction. What are some of the things that stayed with you so far?
I think certainly the continuation of the message that China is open for business, that it welcomes foreign products, and services, and it's very important in the context of China's economic restructuring and this rebalancing toward consumption. And I think particularly because a lot of the purchasing is now done via e-commerce, it's a great equalizer for the consumer, right? The consumer has the choice of buying what they want. And from a Canadian business perspective, no matter what the sector, what we want is the opportunity to sell our products and services in China so that people have a choice. And so that openness is something that we not only welcome, but we also want to see concrete progress on. We do a survey every 2 years of our members to say, what are your barriers to doing business in China? And I think many Chinese companies will tell you they have some of the similar barriers, which are administrative hassles, all the things, all the sort of mafan parts of
You mean
business.
Chinese companies doing business in Canada? Or
well,
here.
Interestingly, the Chinese companies doing business in Canada tell us the same thing, that many of their hurdles are administrative. But I think here in China, because a lot of the reform objectives have been related to simplification, a single window service, that kind of thing. I don't think it's that much easier for local companies than it is for foreign companies. But as a foreign company that might be thinking about China as well as the US or other countries, a reduction in complexity is going to help those Canadian companies to say yes to a market like China.
Okay, I hope specific measures are in the pipeline.
So do I.
We'll definitely bring them out as soon as they're there. However, given the current circumstances, I think still there is some potential to be tapped into, and in terms of the structure of exports from Canada as well. I understand there is huge enthusiasm for the Chinese for quality food, quality medical care, and Canada has a lot to offer on those fronts. What are some of the strongest recommendations that you would like to make here?
So one of my favorite stories is a member of ours. It's a hospital out of Winnipeg that runs something called the Canadian Wellness Institute. They signed an agreement with a couple of Chinese partners to open up 600 different points of service as a part of their Wellness Institute, which focuses on chronic disease prevention and care. So keeping people out of hospitals and keeping them healthy and managing diseases like hypertension or diabetes or things like that. That's on the service side of things, where I think a lot of Canadian companies, if they understood better the opportunity, we'd see many more venturing in as boldly as the Canada Wellness Institute has.
Now, I'm going to talk about the overall trade relationship between China and Canada vis-à-vis Canada's trade relationship with other countries. We know that bilateral trade between China and Canada is only 4%. Compared to your export to the United States, which is 75%. Although it is going up between China and Canada 15% last year, still the gap is very big. I was talking to the Canadian ambassador to China, Mr. McCallum, and he said that Canada wants to diversify its trade, and the primary channel for that is China. So what kind of urgent need would you say there is for Canada to really diversify its trade portfolio?
I think it is very important. You know, Canada was kind of on tenterhooks over the last number of months while we were renegotiating NAFTA. And the difficulty in that renegotiation, I think, was a wake-up call to those who may have thought that it was just fine to be comfortable with our nice 75% of exports going to the U.S. But I think the other important thing is to look at where is the world growing. And China bringing fully a third of the world's global incremental growth every year means companies have to be here. So I'm quite heartened to see that not only was trade up last year by 15%, but in the first, I believe, 8 months of this year, our exports were up 23%, which is the highest I've seen in many years. And that just speaks to the Chinese appetite for food, beverage, and any other kinds of products that we may be sending.
Right. Well, there's a very ambitious goal between China and Canada. I understand that the goal is to double our trade from 2015 by 2025 in 10 years' time. The level in 2015 was $67 billion US. So how optimistic are you to reach that double level? Because in the past 2 years, trade has more or less stayed relatively the same.
It was fairly flat, and you know, it had been growing. And again, we especially look at the exports to China, because imports from China have never been a problem. There's quite a big surplus, and I also don't worry about the surplus so much as I look at, is the relationship growing? And I think that the increased focus by Canadian companies on growing their channels in China does make that goal definitely possible. Interestingly, the doubling of that trade number doesn't include things like education or those healthcare services we mentioned.
So we're only talking about services in goods, okay. And President Xi, I'm going to say, he also sent a very important message that China wants to build a world-class business environment. Again, coming back to his speech, he said that China is resolute in meting out in a law-binding manner punishment for violations of the lawful rights and interests of foreign investors, particularly IPR infringements. And China wants to put in place a punitive compensation system to significantly raise the cost for offenders. For your members, do these words meet their expectations?
They're very welcome words, for sure. And interestingly, intellectual property protection is one of the bright spots, actually, in progress over the last few years. We survey our members every 2 years, and for many years, IPR was the #1 challenge. So in 2012, still at #1. In 2014, it had fallen to #4. And in 2016, it was way down at #13, which means it's a manageable business problem. You can't not pay attention to it, but if you register your IP, you chase down those that violate it, and you choose to take it to court, you can win. A lot of companies, though, don't believe that's the case, because the speed of change in China is so fast that if you look at, 10 years ago, what was happening to IP, companies that still think that's the situation may choose not to enter China. So certainly any additional focus that President Xi can put on the respecting of IP will make it easier to encourage companies to come here.
Do you also think there's a gap of information there that although much is being done here, it has not been talked about so much? Every time you hear about IPR, it's like China is the violator.
Oh, yes.
Whereas that has changed a lot.
And we've worked specifically with the Canadian Intellectual Property Office, which is our government counterpart to China's State Intellectual Property Office. And we've done things like roundtables with both offices, bringing companies in. And we did a cross-country series this year specifically focused on spreading that word about intellectual property protection.
That's great.
And those sorts of regular dialogues, and the fact that they were not happening for a few years before that, are very important, because our competitor countries, Britain, the US, Australia, they have these regular meetings, and those are a place to take issues in the relationship and move them up to get resolved. Particularly in the absence of something like a free trade agreement, you need a means to get to these issues. So the fact that it is happening, and it's happening now, particularly right after NAFTA being renegotiated, means we're free now to think about other things. And so we're very pleased that those ministers are coming.
You talked about the absence of a free trade agreement between China and Canada. Okay, let's talk a little bit about that. I know the two countries have had exploratory discussions on this issue, but not so much progress yet. Do you think a free trade agreement would realize the goal, for instance, of doubling trade in a very short period of time and diversify Canada's trade?
I think we're very much in favor of a free trade agreement. I'm not sure we would get it done in time to meet that goal. I think the goal can be met via other means. But the reason a free trade agreement is something that is desirable is because it sets in place the rules for how things get done. Because although public sentiment toward an FTA has definitely, it's in the majority now, the question is, do we need it? And many companies, to be honest, if they're not in sectors that have tariff issues, have said, we think the benefit of an FTA is the vitality of the relationship that will result from having that agreement, but there might not be anything specific in it for me. Very few people, if any, told us, I don't want one.
Yeah, what is your argument to them? Do you agree, or?
I think I agree that the health of the relationship is very important, and whatever measures need to be put in place, whether you're working toward a straight FTA, a comprehensive economic partnership, that is very important. It's when the political relationship stagnates that the business level can't get things done as quickly as they want. And I think it's telling that in the context of CIIE, I met with my New Zealand counterpart yesterday. Now, New Zealand has had an FTA with China for quite a while. They have officially something like 140 companies signed up to the commercial exhibition, whereas we have, I think, officially maybe 50 or 60. There are more than that participating overall. But why should we, as a country of 35 million people, have fewer companies than a country of, how many does New Zealand have? 5 million,
well,
maybe?
Australia has a free trade agreement with China, and they're benefiting tremendously from that. You should tell your Canadian members.
I told our parliamentary committee earlier this year how Australia's wine industry hit $1 billion in sales to China for the first time last year. That's its first $1 billion market. We're not anywhere close.
Some people are saying the reason why the exploratory negotiations or discussions about FTA between China and Canada were not successful because Canada was putting a lot of conditions, for instance, on environment, on labor rights, on human rights and gender. How do you look at those standards?
Well, I mean, certainly Canada and our government officials have a very strong focus on values, and they want those values to be a part of agreements that are signed. But I think we also have to understand that in one fell swoop, we can't just change China overnight. And so I think there are ways to pursue progress on such issues, particularly in a trade agreement. You're talking business, right? So whether it be gender or labor rights, I think there are ways to get to satisfactory outcomes without necessarily assuming that a country of 35 million can change a country of 1.4 billion people.
We will change towards the common prosperity of the world, let's say, but in our
China's
own
not going
pace.
to change it because we say you should, right?
In our own pace, in our own fashion. I think it's very difficult to change the tradition of thousands of years overnight.
You know, I used to work for Kodak, and we had a lot of business in China, and I used to say if you take a snapshot of China at any given time, there may be things you don't like about it, but the important thing is to look at the video of China and how fast it's changing and how on many fronts China is changing faster than we in the West did ourselves.
Okay, we have to leave it there. It was a pleasure talking to you. Sarah Kutulakos, Executive Director of CanadaChina Business Council.
Pleasure to be here. Thanks.
And with that, we come to the end of this edition of The Point with me, Li Xin. As always, you can follow me on Facebook and Twitter using the handle The Point with LX. Download the application called CGTN to watch the show on your mobile devices, or go to YouTube and look for CGTN The Point. Thanks for watching. You've got The Point.